The screams of 30,000 people echo through Constantinople's hippodrome as blood soaks into sand, where a child once performed unspeakable acts. Empress Theodora stands motionless in the imperial box, purple silk draped over shoulders that once bore nothing but shame. The metallic stench of blood mingles with memories. This same arena, these same stone seats, the same roaring crowd. But today, they don't cheer for her degradation. They die for it. Below her, Belisarius's soldiers work with mechanical precision, cutting down Green Faction members who, 22 years ago, watched a 10-year-old girl perform acts that would haunt an empire. The massacre continues for hours. She doesn't blink. She doesn't leave. She orchestrated every sword stroke, every dying gasp, every mother's wail. This isn't madness. This is mathematics. 30,000 lives for 6 years of childhood torture. The crowd that once threw coins at her naked body now pays in blood. How did a 10-year-old girl, forced into history's most depraved performances, become the puppet master of an empire? To understand how childhood trauma became imperial terror, we must rewind through 2 decades of systematic abuse, calculated revenge, and the weaponization of intimacy that would reshape Byzantine law forever. It begins with a father, his bears, and a betrayal that would cost 30,000 lives. The massive brown bear's chain snapped with a sound like breaking bones. But 5-year-old Theodora didn't flinch. Her father, Acacius, had taught her the first rule of survival: never show fear to predators. In Constantinople's sprawling hippodrome, the Green Faction employed her father as their bear keeper, a position that meant more than just managing animals. Bear keepers held sacred trust. They controlled the beasts that entertained 80,000 screaming citizens during chariot races. They knew which animals to drug, which to starve, which to enrage. Power flowed through their hands like the chains they held. Theodora learned to read the bear's moods before she could read words. A twitch of the ear meant aggression. Lowered heads signaled submission. Her tiny hands helped prepare their meals, mixing herbs that could calm or incite. Acacius treated this knowledge as holy scripture, whispering secrets while they worked. Control the beast, control the crowd, control the city. The Green Faction provided protection in exchange for this service. In Constantinople's brutal streets, faction membership meant survival. Greens wore their color like armor. Merchants gave them better prices. Guards looked away from minor crimes. Orphans and widows found shelter under their banner. Without faction protection, a family became prey. But the bears weren't the real predators in Constantinople. Behind marble columns and silk curtains, men traded children like grain. The city's entertainment industry demanded fresh bodies for increasingly depraved shows. Faction leaders supplied them. Parents who refused found their shops burned, their sons conscripted, their daughters taken anyway. Acacius's position shielded his 3 daughters from these hunters. The bears he commanded were less dangerous than the men they entertained. Then plague swept through the hippodrome's animal pens. Acacius worked through fever, desperate to save his charges. The disease that killed the bears took their keeper too. Theodora watched her father's body convulse in the same way she'd seen poisoned animals die, muscles seizing, foam bubbling from blue lips, eyes rolling white. She was 5 years old. Within hours of his burial, a single bribe would seal her fate. Her mother discovered their protector dead when creditors arrived at dawn. The Green Faction's protection died with Acacius. By noon, men circled their door, like the wolves that haunted Constantinople's walls. Her mother gathered her daughters, Comito, Theodora, and baby Anastasia, knowing they had hours before the hunters claimed their prize. The position of bear-keeper could save them. It passed from father to son by tradition, but Acacius left only daughters. Her mother's new lover, a Syrian dancer, could take the role if the Greens approved. They dressed in their finest clothes, patches hidden with careful stitching, and walked to the hippodrome. Theodora remembered the journey in fragments, her mother's trembling hand, Comito's tears, the weight of baby Anastasia in her small arms. But someone had arrived first. When Asterius counted his gold that night, he had no idea he just created the Empire's future executioner. The dancing master's coins clinked as he pocketed the bribe. The exact sound Theodora would remember 22 years later. Asterius, the Green Faction's choreographer, had accepted payment from another man who wanted the bear-keeper position. By Byzantine law, such positions were sold to the highest bidder when no male heir existed. Theodora's mother hadn't known about the auction. She'd spent their last coins on funeral rites. The Greens' assembly hall thundered with drunken laughter when the widow entered with her daughters. Faction members lounged on benches, passing wine and placing bets on the next day's races. The choreographer Asterius sat among the leaders, gold coins still warm in his purse. Theodora's mother fell to her knees in the traditional gesture of supplication. She placed wreaths on her daughters' heads, the symbol of innocence, seeking mercy. "My children will starve," she begged. "Their father served you faithfully. Grant his position to my new husband. Let him tend your bears." Asterius spoke first, voice thick with wine and cruelty. "The position is filled. Take your brats to the streets where they belong." The faction leaders laughed. One threw a coin that struck Comito's face. Another suggested the girls were pretty enough to earn their bread in other ways. Theodora memorized each face, each voice, each cruel gesture. Her child's mind couldn't process the full meaning, but her memory recorded everything with crystalline clarity. The Blues watched from their side of the hall. Eternal rivals of the Greens, they seized any opportunity to humiliate their enemies. When the Green leaders rejected the widow's plea, the Blues leader, Nas, stood. "We'll take them," he declared. "Let Constantinople see which faction shows mercy to orphans." But mercy came with a price no child should pay. The Blues didn't need a bear-keeper. They had their own. They needed performers for the increasingly extreme shows that drew crowds to their section of the hippodrome. Nas looked at the three girls with an appraiser's eye. Comito, the eldest at 12, showed promise of beauty. Theodora, at 5, had unusual grace. Even baby Anastasia might prove useful in time. The widow had no choice, starvation or degradation. Constantinople offered no third option to women without men. She accepted the Blues' protection, not knowing she'd just traded her daughter's innocence for bread. The faction housed them in quarters near the hippodrome where other performers lived. Thin walls couldn't muffle the sounds that emerged nightly. Theodora learned new vocabularies of pain. The Blues' protection would prove worse than abandonment. Their trainers arrived within days to assess the new acquisitions. They examined the girls like livestock, checking teeth and limbs and flexibility. Comito would train as a citharist, a musician who played naked. Theodora showed acrobatic potential. Baby Anastasia would wait her turn. The dancing master who evaluated them was Asterius's counterpart in the Blue faction. He'd perfected the art of breaking children into compliance. His methods were scientific. calculated doses of hunger, systematic humiliation, careful application of pain that left no visible marks. He explained the rules with clinical detachment. Obedience brought food, resistance brought suffering. Excellence might bring favored treatment. Failure meant the streets. But Byzantine entertainment demanded more than simple nudity. Audiences had grown bored with conventional displays. They wanted spectacle, degradation, the simulation of myths where gods ravaged mortals. The choreographers competed to create increasingly shocking tableaus. What happened in the theater's dark corners, when patrons paid for private encores, remained unspoken but understood. Theodora's training began immediately. At 5, she learned to contort her body into positions that drew gasps from crowds. The dancing master's stick corrected every imperfect angle. Hunger sharpened her focus. She mastered tumbling, balancing, the art of making flexibility seem effortless while muscles screamed. But acrobatics were only preparation. At age 10, Theodora would learn exactly what kind of performances bought bread in Byzantine Constantinople. 80,000 voices roared as the trained geese descended on the naked child. The hippodrome sand burned under stadium torches, while Theodora held position. Every muscle locked, despite the birds' beaks tearing at intimate flesh. This was Leda and the Swan, the blues' most requested performance. The myth of Zeus raping Leda transformed into live entertainment. The choreographer had spent months training the geese to attack specific targets on command. The systematic nature of child exploitation in Byzantine entertainment followed careful protocols. Performers began with simple nudity, graduating to interactive displays. The progressions ensured audiences always had fresh depravities to anticipate. Theodora had started with acrobatic displays at age 8. By 9, she performed naked pantomimes. Now at 10, she'd reached the interactive phase where animals or objects became part of the show. She'd learned to dissociate during performances, a survival mechanism that separated mind from body. While the geese attacked, her consciousness floated above the arena, observing rather than experiencing. She counted stones in the wall. She memorized faces in the crowd. She noted which senators leaned forward, which merchants palmed themselves through their robes, which priests pretended to look away while watching through their fingers. The performance lasted 20 minutes. Musicians played frantic melodies to mask any sounds of distress. The choreographer had taught her to arch and writhe in ways that suggested pleasure rather than pain. "Make them believe you want it," he'd instructed. "The illusion sells the show." She'd practiced with stuffed birds until muscle memory took over. Between acts, performers huddled in underground chambers, tending wounds and preparing for the next show. The older girls taught survival tricks, vinegar to prevent infection, poppy tears to numb pain, techniques to minimize damage during the worst acts. They shared bitter wisdom about which patrons to avoid during private performances, which faction leaders took pleasure in genuine suffering rather than theatrical simulation. But she wasn't just enduring, she was learning. Each performance became a lesson in human psychology. She observed how power aroused different men differently. Senator Hypatius always sat in the 3rd row, left side, breathing heavily during the animal acts. Judge Procope preferred the domination scenes. General Vitalian paid for private shows involving multiple girls. She filed away every preference, every weakness, every shameful desire that powerful men revealed when they thought they watched a mindless child perform. The blues rotated their performers to prevent audiences from growing bored. Theodora mastered every role. The innocent virgin, the wanton seductress, the reluctant victim, the eager participant. She learned that men's desires were boringly predictable. They wanted to feel powerful. They wanted to break something pure. They wanted permission to unleash appetites that civilization forced them to hide. Each senator's face burned into her memory. She created mental files on Constantinople's elite, updated after every performance. Senator Hypatius, sadist who preferred young boys but settled for girls when necessary. Judge Anastasia paid extra to hear performers cry. Merchant Demetrolos wanted girls to call him father during private shows. General Constantine, so violent he'd killed 2 performers, but his gold bought silence. The other girls saw tormentors. Theodora saw future targets. She understood something they didn't. These men's presence here was weakness. Every visit to the theater was blackmail material. Every perverted request revealed leverage. Every coin they threw came with invisible strings attached. She was 10 years old and already thinking like an empress. Her signature performance became the barley feast. She'd lie naked on stage while attendants scattered grain across her body, then released trained geese to peck the barley from her skin. The act combined humiliation, pain, and the illusion of bestial pleasure. Audiences threw gold when she performed it. The choreographer made it her weekly special show. For 6 years she performed, and for 6 years she built a mental database of every powerful man's weakness. Senator Hypatius always requested the same degrading act. 16 years later, she'd remember this when signing his death warrant. But in the moment, as a 16-year-old performer, Theodora simply filed the information away, like a merchant cataloging inventory. The private room stank of wine and sweat. Hypatius's particular fetish involved recreating scenes of military conquest, with Theodora playing the conquered city. He paid triple the standard rate for the elaborate charade. She'd evolved beyond mere survival by this point. Where other performers saw endless degradation, Theodora recognized a classroom. Each client taught lessons about power, desire, and vulnerability. She studied their speech patterns, noting how vocabulary changed when blood flowed away from their brains. She memorized their political connections, family scandals, and financial pressures. Information became currency more valuable than the gold they left on her table. The education happened in fragments between performances. While Hypatius grunted through his fantasy, she listened to his complaints about grain shipments from Egypt. He mentioned names, dates, and bribery amounts without realizing the naked girl beneath him was recording every detail. Politicians spoke freely around prostitutes, considering them furniture rather than people. This blindness became her university. Knowledge became her only currency. She traded information with other performers, building a network of intelligence that spanned Constantinople's underbelly. The Egyptian dancer Antonina knew which judges took bribes. The Syrian acrobat Macedonia tracked military movements through her officer clients. The Cappadocian twins reported religious heresies whispered by drunken priests. Theodora became the hub where all intelligence flowed. She learned manipulation from Constantinople's most experienced courtesans. Old Sophia, scarred from decades in the trade, taught psychological warfare. "Men's minds are simple machines," she'd say. "Push the right levers, get predictable results." Sophia demonstrated how to manufacture emotional dependence, create false intimacy, and program obsession. Every technique had been tested across thousands of clients. The psychological armor Theodora built went beyond simple detachment. She developed multiple personas, each crafted for specific situations. the innocent waif for men who wanted to feel protective, the eager student for those who needed to feel wise, the dangerous woman for those aroused by risk. She switched between masks seamlessly, never letting anyone glimpse the calculating intelligence beneath. Her specialty became emotional manipulation rather than physical performance. While other girls relied on beauty or technique, Theodora mastered the art of reading desires men didn't know they had. She'd study a client for minutes, then mirror back exactly what they craved, not just sexually, but emotionally. The lonely wanted understanding. The powerful wanted challenge. The weak wanted dominance. She became whatever fed their deepest hunger. The other girls saw clients. She saw future victims. Every session was reconnaissance for some undefined future campaign. She didn't know what she was preparing for, only that information and leverage would matter when the opportunity arose. She cultivated relationships with servants, guards, and secretaries. Her network expanded beyond the theater into palaces, barracks, and merchant houses. Physical skills were tools, nothing more. She learned exotic techniques from travelers, Indian positions that enhanced pleasure, Persian methods of delay, Egyptian arts of enhancement. But these were just bait. The real work happened in conversation afterward, when men lay vulnerable and loose-tongued. She extracted secrets like a surgeon removing organs so skillfully they never felt the blade. Her reputation evolved from mere performer to essential experience. Powerful men specifically requested her, not for her beauty, but for something indefinable she provided. She made them feel understood, important, forgiven for their darkest impulses. They left, believing they'd found a confidant rather than hired a prostitute. Many became regulars, returning weekly to unburden themselves. When the Syrian governor arrived seeking Constantinople's most skilled courtesan, Theodora knew her real education was about to begin. Hessabolis commanded 10,000 soldiers, but in their bedchamber, he whimpered like a child. The Syrian governor had purchased Theodora as a concubine, bringing her to his posting in Pentapolis, Libya. For him, she represented the ultimate status symbol, Constantinople's most notorious performer, as his personal property. For her, he was a laboratory for testing years of theoretical manipulation on a single powerful subject. The power dynamics shifted from their first night together. Hessabolis expected a grateful subordinate. Instead, Theodora deployed 16 years of training with surgical precision. She began with calculated vulnerability, sharing fabricated traumas that mirrored his own childhood wounds. Within a week, he was confiding military secrets he'd never told his own officers. She responded with perfectly calibrated empathy, becoming the understanding he'd never found elsewhere. She learned his military secrets between sheets. Troop movements, supply routes, defensive weaknesses, all spilled out during pillow talk. Hessabolis commanded the entire Libyan frontier, responsible for defending against desert raiders and maintaining order in 5 major cities. His position required constant correspondence with Constantinople. Theodora read every dispatch, memorizing names, relationships, and power structures within the imperial bureaucracy. The manipulation went beyond simple informations gathering. She studied how power functioned at provincial levels, where distance from Constantinople created opportunities for independence. Hessabolis skimmed taxes, sold military positions, and negotiated private deals with desert tribes. She learned the mechanics of corruption, the delicate balance between enrichment and treason. Every lesson would prove valuable in her future rise. She experimented with different forms of control. Sexual dependency was easiest. She introduced him to pleasures that became necessities, then withheld them strategically. Emotional manipulation required more finesse. She created jealousy scenarios, making him compete for affection he'd already purchased. She alternated between cold distance and passionate intensity, training him like her father had trained bears. But even she didn't expect the cruelty of his betrayal. After 2 years, Hessabolis received orders to return to Constantinople. A new governor would replace him. Instead of bringing his concubine home, he decided to abandon her in Libya. Perhaps he'd grown tired of her. Perhaps he sensed the danger of her intelligence. Perhaps he simply enjoyed cruelty. He left her in Apollonia with nothing, no money, no connections, no way home. The abandonment was calculated to destroy her. A woman alone in Libya faced slavery or death. The desert killed faster than predators. Cities offered no refuge for foreigners without protection. Hessabolis probably assumed she'd die within days. Another disposable woman lost to the empire's margins. He underestimated the education he had provided. Theodora's survival instincts, honed through childhood trauma, kicked in immediately. She had information, names of merchants, shipping schedules, military patrol routes. She had skills, languages learned from international clients, techniques of persuasion, the ability to become whatever someone needed. Most importantly, she had rage transmuted into icy determination. The desert couldn't kill what Constantinople's streets had already forged. She began the journey back to Constantinople, EC. One ship, one captain, one weapon at a time. The first captain thought he was exploiting a desperate woman. She let him believe it while memorizing his cargo manifests, learning trade routes that connected Libya to Egypt. She discovered which goods moved legally and which required bribes. By the time they reached Alexandria, she knew more about his business than his own accountants. Each port became a classroom, each ship a new curriculum. She learned maritime law from a Phoenician merchant, navigation from a Greek captain, combat techniques from a retired marine. Every man who thought he was using her became her unwitting teacher. She accumulated knowledge like armor, preparing for a war she couldn't yet name. The journey took a year. By the time she reached Constantinople, she transformed from discarded concubine to educated predator. She understood commerce, law, military structure, and provincial administration. She carried mental maps of trade routes, lists of corrupt officials, and blackmail material on dozens of powerful men. The girl who left as a victim returned as a weapon, and Prince Justinian was about to become her target. Captain Marcos thought he was exploiting a desperate woman. He never noticed his shipping manifests disappearing. The Greek merchant vessel creaked through Mediterranean swells while Theodora played her role perfectly. The grateful refugee trading favors for passage. But while Marcos sweated through their encounters, she memorized every document in his cabin. Grain shipments from Egypt, silk deliveries to Constantinople, tax evasion schemes, names of corrupt port officials. Each theft added another weapon to her arsenal. Her education continued with methodical precision. In Alexandria, she seduced a customs officer who explained import regulations while thinking he impressed a simple girl. She learned which goods faced restrictions, which bribes opened warehouses, which merchants monopolized specific trades. The information seemed random, but Theodora was building a comprehensive understanding of the empire's economic circulatory system. The next ship carried military supplies. The quartermaster, drunk on Egyptian wine, boasted about selling imperial weapons to barbarian tribes. Theodora memorized every transaction, every contact, every treasonous deal She learned how military corruption functioned, which officers participated, how profits were hidden. The quartermaster thought she was too stupid to understand. He'd learn otherwise when she needed leverage against the military establishment. By Alexandria, she knew every trade route from Britain to India. She'd mapped the Mediterranean's commercial networks through pillow talk and stolen documents. She understood seasonal patterns, profit margins, and which cities specialized in which goods. This knowledge would later allow her to manipulate imperial finances, knowing exactly where to apply pressure for maximum effect. Each ship became a training ground for different skills. On a vessel carrying diplomats, she learned court protocols and international relations. The ambassadors discussed treaty negotiations, assuming the woman serving their wine couldn't comprehend political nuance. She absorbed lessons on Byzantine diplomatic strategy, the balance of threats and bribes that maintained imperial influence. She learned to read the subtle signals that preceded war or peace. Building a network required patience and strategy. She identified useful people in every port, not the powerful, but those who served power, secretaries who read confidential documents, servants who overheard private conversations, guards who knew who entered and left. She cultivated these contacts with small favors and careful attention, creating information channels that would outlast her journey. Physical survival demanded its own education. She learned knife fighting from a Sicilian sailor, poison recognition from an Arab merchant's wife, basic medicine from a Jewish physician. Each skill was acquired through calculated relationships, trading what men wanted for what she needed. Her body was currency, but her mind was the vault where real wealth accumulated. The final ship brought her to Constantinople's harbor and her destiny. She stood at the rail, no longer the desperate girl who'd fled to Libya. The city's skyline hadn't changed, but her understanding of it had transformed completely. She saw not buildings, but power structures, not people, but networks, not opportunities, but vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. She carried no gold, owned no property, commanded no followers, but she possessed something more valuable: comprehensive intelligence on the empire's hidden workings. She knew which senators took bribes, which generals sold supplies, which merchants cheated taxes. She understood trade routes, military logistics, and diplomatic protocols. Most importantly, she'd learned how to weaponize information. The harbor district hadn't forgotten her. Former colleagues whispered about her transformation. The girl who'd left as Hesebololus's plaything returned with an aura of dangerous purpose. She moved differently, spoke differently, evaluated people with predatory calculation. Word spread through Constantinople's underworld. Theodora had returned, and she was hunting bigger game. She rented a small room near the palace district, choosing location over comfort. Her remaining contacts in the theater world provided intelligence on current affairs. Prince Justinian had risen to prominence as his uncle Justin's heir apparent. He was brilliant, ambitious, and unmarried. Most importantly, he was known for unconventional interests and disregard for social propriety. The girl who left as a victim returned as a weapon, and Prince Justinian was about to become her target. Justinian thought he was choosing a mistress when he met her. He was actually selecting his handler. The prince's interest in unconventional women was well known in Constantinople. While other royals pursued virginal aristocrats, Justinian frequented intellectual salons where reformed courtesans debated philosophy. Theodora infiltrated these gatherings with calculated precision, crafting a persona designed specifically for his psychological profile. She'd studied him for weeks before their first encounter. Justinian was 40, unmarried, and obsessed with legal reform. He slept 3 hours nightly, spent fortunes on architectural projects, and trusted no one completely. Palace servants reported his preference for theological debates over small talk. His previous relationships had failed because women either bored him intellectually or threatened him emotionally. Theodora designed herself as the perfect solution to both problems. Their meeting appeared accidental. She had positioned herself at a theological debate, arguing the monophysite position with enough sophistication to draw attention, but enough errors to need correction. Justinian couldn't resist educating her. She played the eager student, asking questions that led him to explain his deepest convictions. By evening's end, he believed he'd discovered a rare mind trapped in unfortunate circumstances. Each intimate moment deepened his dependence. Theodora deployed 16 years of sexual expertise, but that was merely the foundation. The real seduction happened intellectually. She challenged his ideas just enough to stimulate without threatening. She remembered every legal principle he mentioned, referencing them days later to show she'd been thinking about his words. She made him feel like the genius he believed himself to be. The age gap worked to her advantage. At 27, she possessed youth's energy combined with experienced wisdom. Justinian had grown tired of simpering aristocrats and cynical older courtesans. Theodora presented herself as neither. Instead, she was the partner who could match his ambition. She spoke of empire-changing reforms, architectural wonders, and legal systems that would outlast Rome itself. The calculated approach extended beyond their private moments. She cultivated his interests, studying law texts to discuss his reforms intelligently. She learned architectural principles to appreciate his building projects. She memorized theological arguments to engage his religious obsessions. Every conversation reinforced his perception that she alone understood his vision. But one woman saw through the performance. Empress Euphemia, Justin's wife, had survived palace intrigue for decades. She recognized a fellow predator immediately. While Justinian saw love, Euphemia saw calculation. While he heard passion, she detected rehearsal. The Empress began warning her nephew, calling Theodora that theater, and predicting disaster. Euphemia's opposition created the perfect dynamic. Justinian's contrarian nature made him defend what others attacked. The Empress's attempts to separate them only drove him closer to Theodora. She played the victim perfectly, never criticizing Euphemia directly, but letting tears fall at strategic moments. Justinian's protective instincts, dormant for 40 years, roared to life. Using years of training to program his obsession, Theodora created artificial scarcity. She'd disappear for days, returning with vague explanations that sparked jealousy. She'd mention other suitors, always inferior to him, but present enough to trigger competition. She withheld affection when he disappointed her, rewarded compliance with carefully rationed intimacy. The same techniques that worked on merchants and soldiers proved equally effective on princes. Power dynamics shifted gradually but decisively. Initially, Justinian held all advantages: wealth, status, authority. But Theodora understood that emotional dependency trumped social hierarchy. She became his confidant for political schemes, his sounding board for legal reforms, his only source of genuine understanding. By the time he realized his need for her exceeded her need for him, the trap had already closed. Empress Euphemia's words echoed through the palace. "That woman will destroy this empire." Within months, Euphemia would be dead. The poison slipped into Euphemia's wine was colorless, tasteless, and learned from Constantinople's most experienced killers. Theodora's years in the theater had taught her more than performance. Survival in that world required knowledge of herbs that could heal or harm. Prostitutes passed down recipes through generations, potions to prevent pregnancy, powders to enhance pleasure, and poisons to eliminate threats. Euphemia had become a threat that required elimination. The Empress's opposition to Theodora had grown from disapproval to active sabotage. She'd convinced Justin to formally prohibit Justinian from marrying a former actress. Byzantine law was clear. Senators couldn't marry performers, and imperial princes certainly couldn't elevate to purple. Euphemia made her position public, calling Theodora a disease that would infect the palace. Every day the Empress lived, Theodora remained locked out of legitimate power. No one questioned the timing of Euphemia's sudden illness. Palace deaths were common. Bad food, contaminated water, or simple exhaustion could kill anyone. The Empress had seemed healthy, but she was elderly. When she collapsed during evening prayers, physicians blamed natural causes. Her symptoms, convulsions, foam at the lips, fixed pupils, matched several common ailments. Only someone familiar with hemlock would recognize the specific pattern. The funeral proceeded with imperial pomp. Justinian mourned appropriately, while Theodora maintained careful distance. She attended no ceremonies, made no public appearances, avoided any action that might link her to the death, but privately she consolidated her victory. Within days of Euphemia's burial, she was pressuring Justinian to change the marriage laws. Justin, grieving and suddenly dependent on his nephew, proved malleable. Justinian presented the legal reform as modernization rather than personal interest. The empire needed to attract talent regardless of birth status. Preventing capable people from advancement based on former professions was wasteful. The law passed quickly, opening marriage between senators and former actresses. No one mentioned this benefited exactly one person. As Empress, her first act revealed her true nature. The wedding was modest by imperial standards. Theodora insisted on avoiding ostentation that might remind people of her origins, but her first imperial decree was anything but modest. She established a network of informants throughout the palace, placing her own people in key positions. Servants, guards, and secretaries who owed their positions to her reported every whisper, every glance, every potential threat. She built a spy network that would make modern intelligence agencies envious, staffed entirely by those who understood exploitation. Her agents weren't aristocrats playing at intrigue, but survivors of Constantinople's bottom rungs. Former prostitutes became ladies-in-waiting, gathering bedroom secrets from noble families. Ex-performers served as entertainment coordinators, monitoring which senators attended which debauched gatherings. Rehabilitated criminals worked as palace guards, understanding threat assessment from both sides of the law. The intelligence apparatus operated with ruthless efficiency. Information flowed up through hierarchical channels, analyzed by people who understood leverage. Theodora didn't care about conventional morality. She cared about power. Which senators cheated taxes, which generals skimmed military funds, which bishops kept mistresses. Every secret became a tool for control. Her eunuchs formed the network's backbone. Castrated men occupied a unique position in Byzantine society. Trusted in women's quarters, dismissed by masculine power structures, driven by different ambitions than intact males. Theodora recruited eunuchs with specific talents. Narcissus for military intelligence, John the Cappadocian for financial surveillance, Peter Barsames for religious monitoring. Each commanded sub-networks of informants. Physical security matched intelligence gathering. She created a personal guard of women trained in combat, eunuchs, former gladiatrixes, street fighters, and survivors of assault. They understood violence from victim and perpetrator perspectives. Their loyalty was absolute because Theodora had saved them from death or degradation. They protected not just her body, but her secrets. The murder of Queen Amalasuntha would demonstrate the network's reach. The Ostrogothic queen controlled Italy, maintaining delicate independence from Byzantine authority. She had made overtures about alliance, even possible integration. But Theodora saw threat rather than opportunity. Another powerful woman, especially one with legitimate royal blood, could not be tolerated. The spy network reached across the Mediterranean, identifying Amalasuntha's enemies and enabling their plot. Every bedroom became a confessional where sins were whispered and recorded. Palace orgies, carefully orchestrated by Theodora's agents, loosened tongues and inhibitions. Hidden observers noted who participated, what they revealed, which perversions they indulged. The information was catalogued, cross-referenced, and stored for future use. Blackmail became state policy. The laws she dictated would outlive empires. Working through Justinian, she reformed Byzantine legal codes to protect women and punish exploitation. Pimps faced execution. Forcing women into prostitution became treason. Rape was redefined from property crime to personal assault. The same system that had tortured her was systematically dismantled through imperial decree. But these individual revenges paled before her ultimate plan. The Greens who abandoned her, would pay in blood. Her eunuchs moved through palace corridors like ghosts, gathering the same secrets she once collected in the hippodrome's back rooms. Narses, her chief intelligence officer, had perfected the art of invisibility. Castrated as a child and sold to the palace, he understood powerlessness intimately. Theodora had elevated him from domestic servant to spy master, and his gratitude manifested as absolute ruthlessness in her service. The parallel government she constructed operated outside traditional Byzantine hierarchies. While Justinian managed the visible empire, laws, armies, and treaties, Theodora controlled the invisible mechanisms. Her network determined which officials received appointments, which merchants won contracts, which generals commanded troops. Every decision filtered through her intelligence apparatus, shaped by blackmail and bribery, her agents deployed. Using sexual blackmail for political control wasn't innovation, but industrialization. Previous rulers had employed courtesans as spies occasionally. Theodora systematized the process. Her agents operated brothels catering to specific tastes. Young boys for those inclined, exotic foreigners for others, specialized perversions for the truly corrupt. Every room was watched, every word recorded, every act catalogued for future leverage. The intelligence network mapped Constantinople's power genome. Who owed money to whom? Which families harbored hereditary feuds? What alliances existed between seemingly unconnected parties? Theodora's analysts, many former prostitutes trained in observation, assembled comprehensive files on every significant figure. When she needed someone destroyed, she knew exactly which pressure points to target. Her reach extended beyond Constantinople through merchant networks and diplomatic channels. The murder of Queen Amalasuntha demonstrated international capacity. The Ostrogothic queen had written to Theodora as sister monarch, seeking alliance, but Theodora read threat in every word. Another woman who'd risen from nothing, who commanded armies, who might prove inspirational to ambitious females across the empire. Intolerable. The assassination was orchestrated through local proxies. Theodora's agents identified Amalasuntha's cousin, Theodahad, as ambitious but weak. They fed him intelligence about the Queen's plans to flee to Constantinople, framing it as betrayal of Gothic independence. They provided funds and diplomatic cover for his coup. When Theodahad had Amalasuntha strangled in her bath, Theodora's hands remained technically clean. Writing revenge into law through the Corpus Juris became her greatest triumph. Justinian's legal reform project aimed to organize centuries of contradictory Roman law. Theodora saw opportunity for encoding personal vengeance into eternal statute. Working through her legal advisors, she shaped provisions that targeted her tormentors specifically while appearing generally applicable. Laws against forced prostitution carried death penalties, but exemptions existed for voluntary participation, ensuring her former colleagues weren't caught in the dragnet. Regulations on theatrical performances specifically banned animal acts involving humans, eliminating the leader and swan that had tortured her. Property rights for women expanded dramatically, preventing the economic desperation that had driven her mother to sell her daughters. Every bedroom became a confessional where sins were transmitted directly to imperial intelligence. Senator Hypatius, who'd paid for degrading private shows when she was 16, now found his every movement monitored. His financial records were audited repeatedly. His associates were investigated for increasingly minor infractions. The pressure mounted slowly, invisibly, but relentlessly. He couldn't prove imperial harassment, but he felt the walls closing. Religious blackmail proved especially effective. Bishops who preached morality while maintaining mistresses found themselves transferred to distant postings. Priests who'd attended the theater for decidedly unholy purposes discovered their past sins documented in unsigned letters. The church hierarchy, already split by theological disputes, fractured further under pressure from Theodora's selective revelations. The laws she dictated would outlive empires because they addressed systemic rather than personal injustices. Future generations would praise Justinian's progressive attitudes toward women's rights, never knowing they originated from an empress encoding revenge. The Corpus Juris Civilis influenced European law for millennia. Every protection it offered women was Theodora's posthumous strike against her abusers. But all these individual revenges paled before her ultimate plan. The Greens who abandoned her would pay in blood. She had spent 20 years preparing for this reckoning. Every piece of legislation, every spy recruited, every secret gathered had built toward one goal. The faction that had thrown her family to the wolves would face imperial justice, not through courts or edicts, but through orchestrated massacre. The Nika riots would provide perfect cover. Theodora had studied Constantinople's riot patterns, understanding how faction violence could be triggered and directed. She knew which grievances would ignite green anger, which provocations would draw them into the streets. Most importantly, she knew how to ensure they'd gather in the Hippodrome, the site of her childhood torture and their approaching doom. January 13th, 532. CE, the Nika riots began exactly as Theodora had calculated they would. January 13th, 532. CE, the Nika riots began exactly as Theodora had calculated they would. Years of manipulation had created perfect conditions for explosion. She'd orchestrated tax increases that hit green merchants hardest. Her agents had spread rumors about blue favoritism in government contracts. Most cunningly, she'd arranged for several green leaders to be arrested on trumped-up charges, then scheduled their executions during race week when emotions ran highest. The factions had rioted before, but Theodora's hidden hand guided this violence toward specific goals. Her agents' provocateurs worked both sides, shouting slogans designed to escalate rather than resolve. When Greens and Blues found common cause against imperial oppression, her people steered their anger toward the palace. When moderate voices counseled negotiation, mysterious accidents silenced them. She had waited 22 years for this moment. Every humiliation in the Hippodrome, every degrading performance, every night spent servicing men who'd watched her childhood torture, all of it had built toward this orchestrated revenge. The rioters thought they were fighting imperial tyranny. In reality, they were walking into a trap 2 decades in the making. Manipulating both factions toward violence required intricate choreography. Theodora's agents spread different rumors to different groups. Blues heard that Greens planned to burn their quarter. Greens learned that Blues intended to assassinate their leaders. Both factions discovered evidence of imperial plans to eliminate their privileges. The lies interconnected perfectly, each confirming the others, building paranoia toward explosion. The riot's first days proceeded as intended. Crowds burned the original Hagia Sophia, destroyed the Senate House, and besieged the palace. Theodora appeared appropriately frightened, clinging to Justinian while secretly coordinating with Narcissus. Her spy network tracked every riot leader's location. More importantly, they identified which Greens had been present during her childhood performances, marking them for special attention. Justinian prepared to flee, but Theodora had other plans. The Emergency Council convened on January 18th with senators and generals debating evacuation. Ships waited in the harbor to carry the imperial couple to safety. Justinian had already begun packing treasures. The empire seemed ready to collapse exactly as Theodora had orchestrated, because collapse would force a specific response. Her burial shroud speech was rehearsed, theater performed for maximum impact. "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss," she declared. "Purple makes a fine burial shroud." The words, stolen from ancient texts, rang with imperial dignity, but their real purpose was manipulating male pride. She knew Justinian couldn't flee after his wife showed more courage than him. Setting up the planned massacre required final preparations. Theodora met privately with Generals Belisarius and Mundus, outlining the tactical situation. The rioters had proclaimed a new emperor, Hypatius, the same senator who'd abused her as a child. They'd gathered in the Hippodrome to crown him. 30,000 people packed into the arena, mostly Greens who'd answered their leader's call. She handed Belisarius a list of names. "These men must not leave alive," she instructed. The general, owing his position to her patronage, didn't question orders. The list contained every Green leader who'd been present when her mother begged for mercy, every choreographer who'd trained children for degrading performances, every faction official who'd profited from the theater's abuse. Mixed among them were hundreds of ordinary Greens, but collective punishment was the point. The tactical plan was simple. Mundus would block the Hippodrome's exits, while Belisarius entered through the Emperor's passage. The crowd, packed tightly for the coronation ceremony, would have nowhere to run. Palace guards, reinforced by Gothic mercenaries who felt no sympathy for Constantinople's factions, would conduct the killing. Theodora insisted on one detail. As she walked to the imperial box overlooking the hippodrome, memories of a naked child performing for these same crowds flooded back. But this time, she held the power. The same stones where she'd writhed under trained geese would soon soak with green blood. The senators who'd paid for private shows would die in the arena where they'd first seen her. The choreographers who'd trained children to perform would breathe their last where they'd stolen innocence. She took her position in the same box where emperors had watched races for centuries. Below, Hypatius accepted the improvised crown while Greens cheered. They couldn't see Belisarius's soldiers moving through the tunnels. They didn't notice Mundus's troops sealing exits. They believed they were making history. They were just not the history they imagined. The first screams erupted from the crowd's edges as Gothic swords began their work. Theodora stood perfectly still in the imperial box, purple silk unmoved by the winter wind. Below her, the massacre unfolded with mechanical precision. Belisarius's soldiers worked in disciplined lines, cutting through packed bodies like harvesters through wheat. The hippodrome that had hosted her degradation now hosted her revenge. Memory and present merged as blood soaked into sand. She saw herself at 10, naked and terrified, while trained birds attacked her body for the crowd's amusement. The same stones, the same walls, the same roar of voices. But now the voices screamed in terror rather than pleasure. Senator Hypatius, who'd paid extra to hear children cry, wailed as soldiers dragged him from his false throne. The slaughter continued methodically. No passion, no frenzy, just systematic execution of her decades-old plan. Gothic mercenaries felt no connection to these Byzantine citizens. They followed orders, earned their gold, and added to the body count. Some Greens tried to flee over walls. Archers waited. Others attempted surrender. Orders were clear. No mercy for anyone on Theodora's list. She counted faces among the dead. There, the choreographer who trained the geese, his head split by an axe. There, the faction leader who'd thrown coins at her mother, his intestines spilling onto sand. There, the merchant who'd organized private shows, crawling until a spear ended his movement. Each death was a debt collected, a payment for childhood torment. Between the dying Greens, she saw ghostly after-images of her performances. The corner where she'd first been displayed naked at 8. The section where senators bid for private encounters. The gates through which men had carried her, broken and bleeding after particularly violent shows. Every location now filled with green corpses, their blood consecrating her revenge. Belisarius approached the imperial box, armor splattered with blood. "The work is nearly done, Augusta," he reported. Military efficiency in his voice, carefully neutral about the morality of slaughtering civilians. He'd killed Persians, Vandals, and Goths. What were a few thousand Constantinopolitans? Theodora nodded acknowledgement, attention still fixed on the arena floor. The massacre took 6 hours. 30,000 entered the hippodrome that morning. Historical accounts vary on how many died. Some say 30,000, others claim 50,000. The exact number mattered less than the completeness. Every name on Theodora's list was crossed off. The Green faction was broken beyond recovery. The survivors would never again hold power in Constantinople. As the last screams faded, Theodora finally moved. She turned from the carnage and walked back through marble corridors to the palace. Behind her, soldiers began the massive task of removing bodies. The hippodrome would be cleaned, sound replaced, normal racing resumed within weeks. But the message was carved into Constantinople's soul. The Empress remembered everything and forgave nothing. Justinian ruled 17 more years after Theodora's death from cancer in 548. But the empire never recovered its vitality. Without her intelligence network, rebellions multiplied. Without her manipulations, the treasury emptied. Without her ruthlessness, enemies pressed borders. He built magnificent churches and compiled groundbreaking laws. But the dynamic force that had driven his success was gone. The emperor, who'd conquered half the Mediterranean, couldn't function without his handler. The legal legacy she encoded into Byzantine law spread across Europe as the Corpus Juris Civilis influenced medieval legal systems. Every protection for women, every restriction on exploitation, every death penalty for forcing prostitution, all of it was Theodora's revenge written into eternal law. Medieval queens studied her precedents. Renaissance jurists quoted her provisions. Modern legal systems still echo her reforms, never knowing they originated from a trafficked child's methodical vengeance. The transformation of trauma into historical change was complete. Where other abuse victims might have sought personal healing, Theodora weaponized her damage into systematic reform. She didn't want therapy. She wanted the system that created her suffering to burn. And burn it did. In laws that outlasted Byzantium itself, in precedents that shaped Western civilization, in the memory of an empress who rose from unspeakable degradation to absolute power. In the hippodrome sand soaked with the blood of 30,000, a trafficked child's revenge became Constantinople's salvation or its damnation, depending on which side of her bedchamber you found yourself.